Welcome to the course on economic warfare. This is the second lecture in this series. The first lecture was an introduction to economic warfare. In that lecture, we understood what economic warfare is and why countries use economic tools to achieve their strategic goals. Today, we'll explore the foundations of economic warfare. We'll discuss its historical roots. You see, economic warfare is not a modern concept. Long before modern weapons came into existence, people already understood that if you control trade, you control power. It is a fact that merchant ships, ports, and trade routes have shaped world history. Yes, they are that important. Trade and commerce have been the lifeblood of every civilization, every kingdom, and every nation. To understand this, let us imagine a region that produced wheat but had no iron. What would it have done? It needed iron to make weapons and tools. So it would have happily traded with another region that had iron but lacked food. In this way, both regions would have fulfilled each other's needs and obtained what they wanted. Both economies would have flourished. That is how trade allowed them to benefit from each other's specialization. This is the importance of trade. And that is what created the incentive to control trade routes. Whoever controlled the trade routes became wealthy. Taxes were collected. Trading hubs became increasingly important. Cities flourished around them. Trade generated enormous revenue, and this revenue funded the military. More money meant stronger armies. Stronger armies protected trade, which generated even more money. So it became a self-reinforcing cycle, a virtuous cycle that created both wealth and power. That explains the cutthroat competition to control trade routes. Obviously, nobody wanted to let go of this incredible opportunity for wealth generation. So that gave rise to intense competition. And where there is competition, there is conflict. Now, conflict is costly. Attacking an enemy's soldiers or capturing cities wasn't easy. There was a very high cost associated with it. So a different approach began to emerge. Instead of attacking the adversary directly, attack their ability to generate wealth, block trade, hurt their economy, and inflict enormous damage on the adversary instead of resorting to direct military action. That is the essence of economic warfare. This approach gave rise to mercantilism. The core idea of mercantilism was that the world's wealth was finite. So if one country wanted to become wealthier, another had to become poorer. That is the only possibility if the total amount of wealth is limited. The size of the pie is fixed. You simply want the biggest piece for yourself. That is why countries began racing to accumulate as much gold and silver as possible. But how do you bring more and more gold into your country? By selling your goods to others. In other words, you have to export more. That is why governments aimed to export more than they imported. Because importing foreign goods meant that gold flowed out of the country. So the objective was to maintain a favorable balance of trade where exports exceeded imports. Every major power wanted that. So it led to intense competition. And eventually, it also led to colonial exploitation. European powers established colonies to serve the interests of their home countries. Cheap raw materials such as cotton, timber, rubber, and tobacco were extracted from the colonies, and manufactured goods were produced from them in the home country. After that, the colonies were forced to buy those finished goods exclusively from the colonizing country. The key word here is exclusively. This means the colonies were allowed to trade only with the colonizer. They had to buy finished goods from the colonizing country. As a result, gold and silver flowed from the colonies to the colonizers. To prevent the outflow of gold and silver from their own countries, the European powers also imposed heavy tariffs on foreign imports. This made imported goods more expensive and less competitive. As a result, citizens were discouraged from buying foreign products and instead purchased domestically produced products. Domestic industries were protected. Governments also granted exclusive trading rights to companies such as the British East India Company. Strict maritime laws were enforced to prevent colonies from trading with rival nations. In this way, the colonies were forced to trade exclusively with their colonizers. Transportation networks were built in the colonies to extract raw materials and to dump finished goods into colonial markets. This system resulted in a massive drain of wealth from the colonies, while the colonizers became wealthy and powerful by earning enormous profits. Mercantilism dominated Europe roughly between the 16th and 18th centuries. During this period, international trade was viewed as a competition rather than a form of cooperation. Accumulating precious metals such as gold and silver was considered essential for increasing national power. European powers began competing fiercely for resources. Mercantilism encouraged governments to actively intervene in trade. There was a race to restrict foreign competition, protect domestic industries by imposing high tariffs, and sell finished goods to captive markets. So it can be said that mercantilism was a form of economic warfare designed to enrich your nation by impoverishing your rivals. It was about accumulating as much wealth as possible while draining the wealth of rival powers in order to weaken their ability to fund their militaries. Blockades were imposed and colonies were sealed off. Rival powers were strictly prohibited from trading with those colonies. The objective was to deprive competitors of valuable markets and access to raw materials. That was economic warfare. It is a separate matter that economic blockades and trade restrictions often ignited military conflicts. Wars were fought over trade routes, commercial dominance, and maritime monopolies. When economic warfare alone did not achieve the desired results, colonial powers did not hesitate to use military force to enforce their trade dominance. Because everybody wanted a larger piece of the pie, control of trade routes became extremely important. Whoever controlled the sea lanes and strategic choke points controlled global wealth. Decline followed when empires lost that control. Trade routes were the lifelines of empires. Lose them and your empire would begin to collapse. Britain rose to prominence by mastering economic warfare, controlling maritime trade networks, and using its powerful navy to strangle enemy commerce. Imagine your territory surrounded by enemy warships. No merchant ships can enter. No exports can leave. Food becomes scarce. Factories run out of raw materials. Prices rise. People panic. Industries shut down. The economy begins to collapse. This is exactly what a naval blockade is designed to achieve. Instead of attacking cities directly, it suffocates the enemy's economy. Britain mastered this strategy. Because it possessed the world's strongest navy, it could dominate the world's sea lanes. During many European wars, Britain blockaded enemy ports and prevented commerce from flowing freely. The objective was simple: destroy the enemy's economy without necessarily winning every battle on the battlefield. This strategy proved remarkably successful. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain used a naval blockade to cut France off from overseas trade. French ports were starved of commerce, industries suffered, and morale weakened. Napoleon tried to fight back with the continental system. Its objective was straightforward. Under this system, British goods were placed under an embargo across Europe in an attempt to cut Britain off from continental markets. Every European country under French influence was ordered to stop trading with Britain. No British goods, no British ships, no British commerce. Napoleon hoped that Britain's industries would collapse. Factories would shut down. Workers would lose their jobs. And economic hardship would force Britain to surrender. But Britain possessed an enormous global trading network. It simply redirected its trade toward Asia and the Americas. Britain countered the continental system by expanding trade with these regions. At the same time, widespread smuggling developed across Europe. Merchants secretly continued trading with Britain because the profits were simply too attractive. Many European economies themselves depended on British goods. When trade stopped, businesses across Europe also suffered. So instead of hurting Britain alone, the continental system ended up hurting Napoleon's own allies. Eventually, many European states ignored Napoleon's orders. Their economic interests proved stronger than their political commitments. The failure of the continental system became one of the factors that weakened Napoleon's empire. In the end, Napoleon's economic warfare hurt his own empire more than it hurt Britain. This teaches us an important lesson. Economic warfare is rarely one-sided. The country imposing economic restrictions often pays a price as well. This lesson remains relevant even today. Actually, there is a pattern. Empires rise when they dominate trade. Empires weaken when they lose that dominance. The Portuguese dominated trade in the Indian Ocean for a time. Then the Dutch replaced them. Later, Britain overtook the Dutch. Eventually, the United States emerged as the dominant global economic power. As trade routes changed and technology evolved, power shifted accordingly. This pattern continues even today. The present-day competition over semiconductor supply chains, rare earth minerals, shipping lanes, digital infrastructure, and artificial intelligence follows the same underlying logic. The tools have changed, but the principle remains the same. control economic lifelines, and gain strategic power. Nations have realized that economic strategies such as blockades, embargoes, and the control of trade routes can be just as decisive as military strikes. Over time, major powers are increasingly relying on economic warfare instead of direct military conflict. The reason is simple. Earlier, there were no nuclear weapons. Today, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons, and several others aspire to become nuclear powers. As a result, any direct military conflict carries the risk of uncontrolled escalation, which could pose an existential threat. In other words, economic warfare offers a way to project power and exert severe pressure while staying below the threshold of open military conflict. There is another reason as well. Modern high-tech warfare is astronomically expensive. A single precision-guided missile can cost millions of dollars, while naval fleets cost tens of billions to build and maintain. By contrast, imposing tariffs, trade restrictions, or asset freezes requires relatively little operational spending. Yet these measures can still inflict multi-billion-dollar costs on the target country's economy. Then there is the political dimension also. During the 18th and 19th centuries, colonial powers operated with far fewer domestic political constraints regarding troop casualties. Today, however, the public in most major powers has a very low tolerance for prolonged military casualties. The evolution of mass media, social media, and information warfare has made this even more challenging. In comparison, economic measures carry much lower political risk at home. That is why countries increasingly prefer economic warfare. In the colonial era, trade networks were fragmented. But today there is globalization. There is interdependence. Restricting access to critical technologies, such as advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment or specialized software, can stall an adversary's industrial and defense sectors for years. Cutting a country off from international financial messaging systems, such as SWIFT, or freezing its central bank's foreign reserves can paralyze an economy quickly without firing a single shot. So economic warfare is not a modern invention. Trade has always been a source of national power. Mercantilism encouraged governments to view economic competition as a struggle for national survival. Colonial empires were built largely to secure resources and control trade. Sea power enabled countries to protect their own commerce while disrupting that of their rivals. British naval blockades demonstrated how economies could be strangled without a direct invasion. Napoleon's continental system showed both the potential and the limitations of economic warfare. And finally, history teaches us that control over trade routes often determines which nations become great powers and which ones decline. However, economic warfare today is far more sophisticated. Countries no longer rely only on naval blockades. They use sanctions, tariffs, export controls, financial restrictions, technology denial, currency pressure, and supply chain manipulation. The battlefield has expanded from the oceans to banks, stock markets, digital networks, and semiconductor factories. So we can say that while the struggle for global trade dominance has remained the same, the methods have evolved into modern tools such as sanctions, tariffs, export controls, and financial restrictions. We'll discuss each of these in the subsequent lectures.